Hey all, Pete here. It's Saturday afternoon and I'm sitting down to do my fourth video in my firearms series where I talk about guns, gun policy, and some of the current issues in the political climate right now about guns. I I want to start by reminding everybody that the purpose of my videos is not to try to convince or persuade you to think the way I do about firearms. It's just to try to promote some better understanding of where people like myself come from when it comes to our feelings about the Second Amendment, gun culture, ownership of firearms, things like that. And also to kind of give you a reasonable perspective from a gun owner. I know there's a lot of snarkiness and hostility on social media and things like that, and I don't think that that helps. And so my goal is to give reasonable, perspectives and responses to some of the things that get said, and to maybe promote some healthy dialogue. Thus far, I've had some really good feedback from people on both sides of the debate, and including some people that are very anti-gun, I should say, I guess. And they thought my videos were really informative and said, I don't know. They said they didn't know if they were necessarily changed their thoughts a whole bunch, but there were some things I said that they've considered that make them think a little bit more about some of the things they say, and how to have these types of discussions. So that's a good sign. I know that it's been a while since I did my last video on guns, and I was kind of waiting to see what was going to happen with the gun reform bill that was being drafted by the bipartisan group, and before I did this, and it looks like they're going to do some red flag laws and some mental health care stuff, and so I'm not sure how I feel about that. I actually don't think that those will have a huge effect on gun violence, but they may. We'll see. Anyway, so we're going to go into this next video. This one's going to be another video on policy, and then I'll probably have one more that I do on policy as well, and wrap up in that last one some of my own thoughts on what I think might be some effective things to do. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Now, we may be photobombed at some point by one of my dogs because my wife is running some errands, and I got my door open here into my man cave because my dogs like to come in and out, but we're going to kind of get started here. So there's two things I'd like to talk about real quickly that I use as a framework for how I think. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a roadmap into how I think about things like policy and stuff like that. Okay, so beyond the importance I put on the Second Amendment, which does include the phrase "shall not be infringed," and I understand that there are many gun owners who feel like any regulation is an infringement. I don't know if I'd go that far, but I think that when the people who wrote the Constitution use a phrase like "shall not be infringed," that's a pretty strong phrase. In fact, I don't know that it could be much clearer. Okay, so I think that that's an important thing to remember. There's a lot of debate about different constitutional issues, and there's a lot of looking at other cases and precedents and things like that. But when it comes to stuff like freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and the right to assemble, and due process, and the right to bear arms, I mean, those things are so clear that I do get a little grumpy when there's any kind of regulation of those things. But I also recognize we live in a society that requires some regulation. It's like this: your right to freedom of speech ends when you yell fire in a crowded theater, right? So there are some necessary regulations, but I also think it's important that we start with an understanding of what the Second Amendment says. And it says shall not be infringed. So if you're talking to a gun owner like me, a Second Amendment guy, when you start talking about putting regulations on something that's a right in the Constitution, be careful. Tread lightly at first, right? Tread lightly, okay? The second thing I want to say about how I think it's just in general when it comes to a lot of things is problem solving steps. I try to be logical, and I approach things using problem solving steps. And I teach problem solving steps to my clients where I work as a counselor. I have a social work degree, like you know from my other videos. And the problem solving steps, a lot of people don't know these, but they're very basic. The first one is to identify the problem. The second one is to gather information and set a goal. The third one is to come up with some possible solutions. The fourth one is to pick a solution and try it. And the fifth one is to evaluate. Did we reach our goal? And so it's really important to think about, if you're going to talk about gun policy, what problem are we trying to solve? Right? And I think sometimes people either, in a lot of policy things or in a lot of life things, they either have too general of a problem or they identify the wrong problem. They don't identify the problem correctly. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit as I go through some of these policy things today. The second thing is in the second step, in the second problem solving step, is just gather information and set a goal. So the goal is what you're trying to accomplish by solving this problem. Okay? And as a counselor, I teach people to set SMART goals, S-M-A-R-T. So S stands for specific, M stands for measurable, A stands for attainable, R stands for realistic, and T stands for time bound. Okay? And so if a goal does not contain those components, it's very likely that it's going to be something that's accomplished. Okay? So keep those are roadmap, a little bit of a roadmap to how my mind works when I'm making any kind of decision or undergoing anything. It's like, okay, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What's the goal here? How is the is that measurable? Is that it's okay. So with that in mind, we're gonna talk about some things that come up in the policy discussion. I'm not necessarily going to tell you what I think needs to happen in this video, but I'm gonna talk about some things that I think might be well intentioned but are oftentimes misguided or too general or have some problems with them. So the first one is a lot of people feel like we need more gun laws. And really, when we're talking about policy, we are talking about passing more gun laws, okay? The problem here is that we have more laws regulating guns than we have at any other time. And we have more mass shootings. So I don't know if more laws by themselves are going to change anything. I just have a problem with the more law answer, because who obeys laws? Law-abiding citizens, right? So law-abiding citizens obey laws. So it's against the law to take a gun and go shoot up a school. So law-abiding citizens aren't going to go and do that. And so more gun laws don't necessarily in and of themselves lend themselves to or produce a result that means less mass shootings. Okay? Even identifying the problem as wanting to have less mass shootings really isn't specific enough. I think if we were going to try to identify a problem we're trying to solve, it would be something like reduce school shootings by 90% over the course of 2 years. Like, so that would be a goal. It's specific, it's measurable, 2 years. I don't know if it's attainable. That's a tough one. Realistic is a tough one. Time bound, yeah, there's a time limit on it, 2 years. So, but that's getting closer to identifying maybe a problem we're trying to solve. But just more laws, I'm not so sure more laws are going to stop school shootings. There's already laws in place. When I go and purchase a firearm, I have to fill out this big form. They call and they do a background check on me to make sure that I'm able to purchase a firearm, that I'm not a felon, that I'm not a fugitive from justice. I mean, that's already in place. Okay, so some people don't understand, don't know that, or don't realize that. So that's already in place. A good question to ask, I think, a good question to ask might be, if we have more laws and more shootings, what else has changed? What else in society has changed? So as a social worker, I understand that, change in society is slow, and problems don't have simple solutions. You don't just have, well, simple solution to this problem, do this. That'll fix it, right? It's like, no, it doesn't work that way. And more laws rarely solve societal woes. And so I guess, I would be curious if we started looking at other trends that have changed. And a few that I can think of right off the top of my head, which I'm not going to go into in depth, is that most of the societal pillars, the foundations of society, have lost their credibility. Okay, and what do I mean by that? Well, politics. There's very little respect anymore for our elected leaders because they lie all the time. And they clearly seem to be more concerned about, posturing and grandstanding and getting reelected than they really are about how do we, create a more efficient, better society for everybody. And so politicians just, everyone when they talk politics, they're a bunch of liars. And so the politics government has lost its credibility. Law enforcement. I have lots of friends in law enforcement. I'm not ripping on cops, but it's certainly no secret that over the last few decades, law enforcement has lost some credibility. They're no longer respected like they used to be. Part of that is a societal problem that law enforcement gets tasked with trying to regulate things in a fairly unjust society, and get asked to do things they're not trained to do, and they're there to enforce laws. That's what they do, and so but anyway, I don't want to get into a big law enforcement thing, but law enforcement have lost a lot of the respect that used to be given to them. Okay, not downing on cops. I'm just saying that is definitely something we can look at that has changed over the last several decades. Family, okay, the institution of marriage. We have tons and tons and tons of single families. It's hard pressed to find anybody who hasn't been divorced or isn't divorced, or and so the institution of marriage in and of itself is kind of like, used to be this thing, people sort of in society looked at marriage as this stabilizing element, and you get married and the marriage stays together and they raise the kids, and there's plenty of research that shows that stable families create stable societies, but marriage is just not real valuable anymore to a lot of people. They just get divorced. Everybody just gets divorced. My parents just get divorced. My mom and dad just got divorced. And it just, they made promises and didn't keep them. And I'm not ripping on anybody who's divorced, because I had a marriage right after I got out of the Marine Corps. It lasted a year and I was divorced. So I'm divorced myself and remarried. But marriage has lost some of its credibility, and it was a stabilizing factor in society. And then the church, and I'm not saying any specific church, I'm just saying the church in general has lost a lot of its credibility. I can speak as a Catholic, and the disgusting, terrible men who abused children as priests has done some damage to my church, and I think they should all rot in prison until they die. I have no sympathy for people who hurt children. But whether it be my fault or not my fault, the church has lost its credibility in society. And so we look at some of these big institutions that used to bring stability to society, they've lost their credibility. And I would even go so far as to say the school systems. My parents were both teachers. I have friends who are teachers. I'm not ripping on all teachers, but when I look at what's going on in our school systems, I'm not impressed at all. And school, for many, many decades in this country was a stabilizing factor, and it just doesn't seem to be anymore as much as it was. So we have some bigger things that have some pillars of society that have changed. Okay, they've changed the landscape. And so do those changes contribute to gun violence? Maybe. Something to think about, okay? Another thing that comes up in the policy discussion is mental illness. And I really get my hackles up on this, okay, for a lot of reasons. One is that, and I'm going to pick on the right here for a minute, Republicans, and I really don't consider myself a Republican or a Democrat. I'm really more of a libertarian, honestly. But I understand that pure libertarianism probably wouldn't be that effective either. And I'll admit to that. But I lean towards libertarianism. But Republicans are always like, we don't need gun control. We need mental health care. Okay, well, they don't fund it, right? And I'm not saying they should. I don't know that it's necessarily the government's job to take care of everybody. I don't agree with that idea. But neither do Republicans, really, right? So why do they keep saying mental health care, but then not fund it? And so it's like, we know you're not going to fund it. I don't necessarily agree that they should fund it, but quit saying it because it's just empty. It's just empty words. You know what I'm saying? It drives me crazy, and it drives me just as crazy as the left that screams about certain rights that they feel are in the Constitution, but would be quick to destroy gun rights. It's like, you don't care about individual rights if you're trying to destroy the Second Amendment. I don't know. There's so much contradiction and hypocrisy in politics between the right and the left. But mental illness really gets my ire up because I'm a counselor and I work with people every day who have mental illness. And mental illness does not a psychopath make. Okay? Just because somebody has a mental illness that they struggle with does not mean that they cannot own a firearm and own one safely and responsibly. In fact, most people can. Okay, now we're talking about severe stuff, severe schizophrenia and psychotic tendencies, things like that. I mean, okay. But like, I really get tired of this. A vet comes back from combat, has PTSD, and they want us to talk about taking his guns or her guns. No. That's totally hypocritical. That's where you can go take guns and go fight over there, but when you come home, you can't have them. Suicide, mental health care for suicide stuff, I feel a little differently about that. There may be times that someone it might be best to not let them have their guns for a little while until they're, okay, free from the harm of fear of, threat of suicide. That to me, that's a little bit different kind of deal. But I mean, someone who struggles with anxiety and you say, well, you can't own a firearm, or someone who struggles with some mild depression or whatever, and like, you can't own a firearm. It's like, no. And if you want to read deeper into some of this stuff, there is some great research out there about the psychological traits of the people who generally engage in these things like school shootings and everything. And mental illness may be a part of it in some cases, but there's the stuff I've read, and I've read several things from more than one source on this. Not just Googling stuff, but some different books about these different mindsets, psychological mindsets and stuff. And it usually starts with that person with some kind of a grievance. They feel that they've been wronged in some way by somebody or some group of people. Okay? Then that anger builds and builds and builds until they decide that the only recourse they have is to commit an act of violence against innocent people. So then they start to plan it, and they pick a target, and they pick a soft target, which is why they pick schools or movie theaters or things like that, because they pick a target that's soft, it's not protected, and they can cause the maximum amount of damage and chaos, which tells me they're cowards and they're bullies, because they're not going in and starting a gunfight at the local chapter of the NRA or at the gun club. They're going where there are children. Okay, so they pick a soft target, And then they make sure they can access it, which means it's a soft target as well. Then they start planning, then they carry it out, and they usually tell somebody they're going to do it in some way or another. Okay? And so, you know, this is a very kind of rigid, clear, concise picture that tends to fit most of these folks who do these go and do these mass shootings and stuff, okay? And mental illness land is far bigger than that. Okay? And so I really just want to say, if you talk to me and say, we got to pass gun laws about mental illness, it's like, what kind of mental illness? Right? I always say, explain, define your terms. Because my clients that I work with, I can't think of any right now who would be unsafe to own a firearm. And, you know, many of them do. And mental illness does not a mass shooter make. Okay, there's other factors, like I explained, in most of these mass shootings, okay? So please keep that in mind in this debate, in this discussion. Stricter punishment for gun crime. That comes up a lot. You know, I'm not opposed to that. Okay. You know, as a deterrent, that may work against some people. But it's not really going to work against the psychological mindset of a mass shooter who's going into a school. They've already decided that that's their only recourse. They know that they will die or be incarcerated. Okay? And so, you know, it's not an issue of, oh, I better not do this because I might get put in prison for longer. You see what I mean? So stricter punishment for gun crime, that's fine. But if we're talking about that for use as a deterrent, that's a punishing consequence. That's what that is. Punishing consequences are not terribly effective. Okay? If they were, then our jails would be empty and there wouldn't be repeat offenders. Because it's like, oh, I did that and got caught and got punished. I'm not doing that again. Right? But their jails are full of repeat offenders. So punishing consequences aren't great deterrents in general, okay? Outlawing or criminalizing certain types of guns based on their potential to cause damage. So this is when we hear a lot about the AR-15, right? You know, oh, it holds 30 rounds in the mag, which it does. I agree. And an AR-15 being fired into a crowd does have potential to do significant damage, as does an AK-47, a Mini-14, a 10-22, an M1A, any one of numerous firearms that are available to civilians, okay? But you start outlining things based on their potential to do damage, I promise you I'm not arguing against this using, you know, the fallacy of what might happen, but in this case I think it's important to think about that because this is a shotgun round. Okay, so a shotgun round. Rounds generally are full of BBs because you shoot them at birds and they pattern. They create a pattern, so you don't have to hit a bird with one projectile. You've got a whole bunch of projectiles that pattern out the farther away they get from the end of the barrel of the firearm. Right? So it gives you a better chance of hitting that bird. Now, they also make shotgun rounds for other things. So there's a shotgun round that's full of buckshot. Buckshot was originally designed, you know, to shoot deer in places generally down south or in places where you don't want to shoot deer with rifles because there's too many things around, so you want a short range weapon. Double-aught buckshot, which is 00 buckshot, looks just like this as well, and inside it there are 9 projectiles. Each one of them is the size of a 9mm bullet. Okay, 9mm projectile. And they pattern out as well, the farther they get from the end of the shotgun. And so somebody with a shotgun that holds 8 shells, which is fairly common for a lot of pump shotguns used by bird hunters, as also used by self-defense shotgun owners, tactical shotguns, which just means a shotgun with a shorter barrel, mainly. A lot of those hold 8 rounds. So 8 times 9, 72, right? So we got 72 projectiles in a shotgun loaded with only 8 shells. And that could do significant damage when fired into a crowd. See what I'm saying? So saying we're going to outlaw the guns based on their potential to do damage, all guns do damage. All guns will kill you just as dead as another gun. Okay? And so it's inconsistent, to say, well, these are the guns that do the most damage, so we'll get rid of them. Because then what happens, say if it worked, which I don't think it would, because people will still get guns illegally. Even President Biden said that, years ago, that he didn't believe gun control would work because people will still get guns illegally if they have criminal intent, okay? But even if it worked, if we could say we're just going to vaporize all the AR-15s, well, the next thing we would vaporize would be the AK-47, right? And then we vaporize the Mini 14 or whatever. And we keep vaporizing these guns until we're down to shotguns and bolt-action rifles. Well, if I wanted to do maximum damage to a crowd, I wouldn't even think about AR-15. I'd be thinking about shotguns, okay? So this is not a how-to video on how to be a psychopath, but I'm just saying it's not consistent to argue against certain types of guns based on their ability to do damage. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, okay? Now, I'll listen to your arguments, and you might persuade me, but I don't know if you're gonna persuade me on that one, okay? Another thing that comes up in the policy discussion is eliminating private gun ownership and limiting it to police and military. Well, aside from the fact that would create a police state, I don't think that's going to work. There are about 393 million firearms in America right now. And I fear that trying to do something like that could result very quickly in kind of a geographical civil war based on different parts of the country. I know I can speak for myself and a lot of other people. We wouldn't give our guns up. I mean, it's not that we would take to the streets necessarily in war, but it's like, nah, they're going to have to come find them and try and get them from me because I'm not going to go willingly turn these in. That's kind of the whole reason the Second Amendment was written, was to prevent takeover of a tyrannical government. It wasn't written for hunting. Everybody hunted, but it's just not a good way to go about it. Another one that comes up is maybe only allowing hunting guns or guns that you need. But as you saw in my first few videos, there are a lot of guns that have a lot of overlap, and a lot of it just depends on the intent of the user. So I have a rifle that's very similar, almost identical to one of the older Marine sniper rifles. And in my hands, it's an elk hunting gun. And in a criminal's hands, it might be a sniper rifle, or in a Marine's hands, it's a sniper rifle. So, on what they're used for or what I need them for, well, that's all depends on the user, and so I don't think that makes a good argument or a good place to try to do policy from. There's been some arguments about making guns safer, and so I've seen some things about like handguns that read your fingerprints so that you're the only person that can fire them and things like that. I'm really opposed to that. I did not get the privilege to serve in combat, but I did receive combat training in the Marine Corps and elsewhere, and there's enough things that can go wrong in a combat situation, in a self-defense situation. We don't need to add to the list. So a self-defense firearm, is actually made less effective by trying to make it safer. There's also a growing body of research out there that suggests that the more safety features we put on things, the more dangerous they become because we stop trusting our own senses and our own instincts, And, now these cars that'll kind of drive themselves and things, I just don't see this going in a good direction. It's better to have things work basic and have some fundamental things that are on there, like a safety or some things like that. But then beyond that, trying to make that gun safer so it doesn't shoot somebody it's not supposed to. The basic laws of firearm handling take care of that. You never point your gun at anything you don't wish to destroy. So I'm really opposed to these ideas about laws that require gun manufacturers to make the gun safer. The gun is safe if you follow the rules of firearm handling and use. Then a gun is safe. A gun doesn't shoot somebody. A person shoots somebody. So I'm opposed to that kind of stuff. I don't think that's a good argument. Raising the age to a more responsible age. Okay, this might make some gun owners mad, but I don't think my ire would get up too much about, a 21 minimum age for certain firearms. I understand it's not very logical, because when I was 17, I was in the Marine Corps carrying an M16. But that was in the Marine Corps. That wasn't, in my neighborhood. Does that make sense? I don't think it would stop mass shootings, but I do think it might change a little bit. It might change gun culture a little bit to just have a little bit more respect for, ownership of those types of guns. It's just like when I was a kid, I had a BB gun. Dad's like, you can't shoot your 22. You're not getting your 22 till you're 12 and you pass hunter safety. Okay. And I looked forward to that, and I think if we slowly moved in this direction with a minimum age for certain types of firearms, it might create a little bit more of a culture around, well, yeah, you own this gun, you can own these guns, but you can't buy one of those till you're 21. And so that I could see how that might change the gun culture a little bit. I don't think it would stop mass shootings, but it might change the gun culture a little bit. Okay. Along with that, the argument for more training, I'm certainly never opposed to more training. And I'll talk more about my views on more training or making that some kind of a requirement for firearm purchase in my next video. Okay. So I hope that this video made you think a little bit. Again, I'm not trying to persuade you. This video was more about addressing some things I hear in this argument and in these debates that I don't think always make a whole lot of sense, and aren't necessarily going to solve the problem if we're defining the problem as we need to reduce school shootings. I don't know if we'll be able to eliminate them, but I think we could certainly significantly reduce them and maybe even eliminate them based on a couple ideas I have that I'm going to share in my next video. Okay, so think about these things. If you disagree, feel free to comment. Just be respectful, and I'll be respectful back. If you agree, comment. Feel free to share this video with your friends. Thanks for watching. I got at least one more to do on guns, and I'll be done with them. And I appreciate your time. Have a great weekend.